All right, we're going to go to this incredible interview, and I'll come back and I'm going to talk about Terminator and what it means in keeping with what I was just talking about. It actually continues the thought that I was having. But you really should read this book, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam by Douglas Murray. It is a brave book. It's a smart book. It's a restrained book, and it's an intelligent book. One of the things that is so touching about this interview is that the first part of the book is very factual and tells you what happened and how this immigration policy has basically put Europe on the ropes. I'm not sure it's going to survive at all. The second half is about what's wrong with Europe and the void at the center of Europe, the spiritual void in the center of Europe. And he said he expected to be attacked over that, and nobody even noticed it. I noticed it. I thought it was a great part of the book. Douglas Murray is he founded the former London-based think tank Center for Social Cohesion, and he's an associate director for the Henry Jackson Society and associate editor for The Spectator, an excellent conservative magazine in England. Here is a really interesting interview with Douglas Murray. Douglas, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
I loved this book. I thought it was just a tremendously brave, intelligent, well-researched and well-reasoned piece. And I'm wondering, what has the reaction been? I know in England, people can really take a lot of hits for expressing opinions like this. Has it been a difficult thing to publish a book like this?
Well, in a way, much less than I thought. I was expecting what a friend described as more witch burning than there has been. The book immediately became a bestseller in the UK. It went to number 1 on the bestseller charts in Britain, and most of the reaction was muted praise. There was a little bit of attempt to shut it down, unsurprisingly, early on from some of the political left in the UK by decrying it with the usual accusations that are used. But I tell you what, the one thing that is striking to me is on the element of the book that is about what has happened, immigration, what it has been in Europe and Britain in recent decades. There has been some objection to me mentioning it as usual, but it's been picked up, it's been discussed. The bit that has struck me is that absolutely nobody, I think, has picked up on what I regard as being in some ways the even more important part of the book, which is the us bit. The bit I describe as the vacuum into which people are walking. And the silence on that I find extraordinary. It
was my favorite part of the book, and I want to get to it, but I want to make sure that people understand what we're talking about when we get to it, as you did in the book, in fact. Let's start about, the strange death. It's called The Strange Death of Europe, and the subtitle is Immigration, Identity, and Islam. So let's talk about immigration. What vision are you putting forward? What have you seen happen through immigration since World War II?
So I start in the post-World War II period when Europe started to invite in the guest workers to help rebuild after the war. But what I see is a speeding up of that process, a sort of losing control of that process by consecutive governments in each Western European country. And then the book really focuses on what then happened in 2015, when Angela Merkel famously opened the doors of Europe to the world and added 2% of the German population in a single year alone, almost 3% to the Swedish population in a single year alone. And I say that's just a speeding up of a process that had long been underway. And it's a losing control of the borders and an unwillingness to really enforce the difference between legality and illegality, to decide that the law really didn't matter all that much, or it was more comfortable not to enforce the law. So that by the time that we're right up to date, you have this situation which I describe as a sort of moroseness that we've got into, where we sort of don't know who's in our countries. When terrible things happen as a result of that, we skirt over them very fast because we don't know what to do. And this, I think, is a catastrophic situation to be in, and indeed a deadly situation to be in.
All through this process, you described the fact that the people didn't want it. The people repeatedly, through every poll, they kept saying, no, please stop. And sometimes the politicians would make speeches as if they were going to stop. Why didn't they?
Well, it became more comfortable for them not to do so. That's my overriding impression. By the time the Blair government came in the late 1990s in the UK, the immigration minister at the time makes this clear. She says removals are very difficult, both for the person undergoing them and for those enforcing them. And so it's just easier not to do removals. That's removals of people who have broken into the country, oughtn't to be there, have failed every round of the appeals process. But even those people, and now you see, when you come straight up to date by the 2015 crisis in Germany, I give an example of something I was told about whilst I was there on one occasion researching for the book, when for once in, I think, 2016 into 2017, for once even the German authorities decided that they had a group of people from Pakistan who had absolutely no right to come into Germany or Europe in 2015, who said that they wanted asylum. They obviously weren't asylum seekers. They just wanted to have the economic benefits of Europe. And Germany put them on a plane to send them back to Pakistan. A very, very rare event, this. And the plane came straight back because the Pakistani officials simply said they wouldn't accept the people. So that's
some of this stuff we're seeing here now in America. We're debating here now in America. We keep hearing, especially conservatives, keep hearing these horror stories about what's going on in Sweden, Germany, the women being raped. Women. You mentioned one story, a couple of stories in the book that I just found mind-bending, where women would be raped but wouldn't report it. They would be afraid of seeming bigoted or making it hard for the immigrants. Are these horror stories true? Is this actually going on? Is this?
Oh yeah. I mean, everything I write in this book, I'm very conscious that there's a tendency to over-egg some of the things that have been going on in Europe in recent years, and there's also a tendency to shut down the argument. So what I've done in this book is through first-hand reporting and from a lot of footnoted, referenced events. Names of people, names of locations. I've made it sort of critic-proof to say what's actually going on, and then to say, look, this is what it is. Are you happy with this? I'm not saying here's how you completely change it or here's how you turn it around. I say here is a situation we in Europe have found ourselves in, and as I say, I think that the striking thing is that you don't need to over-egg any of this. What is going on the ground that you can see is extraordinary. Camps of hundreds of people living on the streets outside the center of Paris, in the suburbs of Paris, living along the sidewalks in tents. It's not that Paris has fallen or anything like that. If you go into the center of Paris, it's as beautiful and charming as it ever was. It's just that if you go slightly outside, this is what you find. It's the same in Sweden, all the other places I've traveled across the continent. Life, to a great extent, goes on as normal, unless you're unlucky enough to be a member of the public and not in the highest net worth bracket, in which case you've got to accept that the society you're born into is in the process of fundamentally changing, whether you like it or not. You don't have a say.
And so much of this, I mean, as I said, the subtitle of the book is called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam. So much of this has to do with Islam and the terror of seeming bigoted by criticizing Islam as if Islam were a race, as if it weren't a set of ideas, and somehow it's wrong to criticize a set of ideas. We hear stories here of English people actually being arrested for saying disparaging things about Islam. I should ask first if those stories are true. Can you actually get arrested or penalized in some way? You
can certainly be called in for questioning, invited in for questioning by the police if you were to, for instance, say certain things about the religion or to be seen to be saying things that are derogatory about a group. I mentioned the Islam thing in the subtitle of this book for a very specific reason. We've seen all sorts of immigration into Europe. What's striking to me about the Islam bit is that it's just obviously at this stage the bit of the immigration that Europe is finding it hardest to digest, and which, maybe it will not be able to digest it. Maybe it won't be able to accommodate it without having to undergo very significant changes, which I think we are undergoing, or with increasingly very disturbing events going on. But the Islam bit is a serious values challenge. We are in this very strange dialogue at the moment as a society with certainly portions of the Muslim communities in Europe, where we in Europe say, we would like you, after all of these decades, we would like you to become like us. And a certain portion of this community says, we don't want to become like you. Look at you. We don't want that. And we say back, are you sure? We'd love it if you joined us. It'd be ever so nice. And they say, no. And then eventually we get to the crucial one, is that they effectively say, what are you going to do about it? And we say, nothing. That's the current status of the dialogue. Right.
And it's very frightening because the stupidity of the debate, at least here, is so intense that it just seems a worthwhile question. Is it possible to have a set of ideas that's antithetical to Western thought? And of course it is.
Yes, I can reassure you that your American debate is positively Socratic compared to the discussion and dialogue in Europe. At least you have a discussion and dialogue on these matters. At least you have outriders, prominent figures who are putting their heads above the parapet. And it is a very, very small number of people remotely willing to do that in Europe at the moment.
Yeah. Let us talk about this idea of the void in Europe. You mentioned the book Submission, which I read last year. Really one of the best, certainly Houellebecq's best novel and one of the best modern novels I've read in several years. And basically the thesis of this book, without giving it away, but the thesis of this book is there's nothing to regret if we leave behind the West. The West is broken and empty. You call it a sense that things are over, a sense that the story is over. Describe that a little bit so people know what we're talking about.
This is the really striking thing to me, is that all of these things are things that have happened to us, all the immigration and so on. But what we're reduced to now is what one French philosopher recently described as, we had this idea that our values would go around the world, and for a time we tried some of that. Then that retreated, and now we're in this morose period of, I wonder if we can hold on to them for ourselves. Now, my view is that there is underneath all of this going on in Europe this sense of ennui, or what I call tiredness. Though we sort of tried everything, we're unpersuaded that we should continue to take our own position in any argument. And we've decided basically to be a sort of United Nations of the world, a place where basically anyone can move in and call it home. And you see, I think this sense of tiredness, the void, is exacerbated by the movement of people into Europe, because you lose your sense of what it is that makes you, or what makes your society, other than that it's a sort of rather nice sort of migrant camp, a grand migrant camp. And so all those things we used to talk about, the British sensibility, or the French manner and so on, all these things become, even those sort of glib bits, become basically passé. They don't really sum up what we've become or what we're in the process of becoming. And, I think that even we have this endless debate in Britain now, what are British values? And they're basically reconfigured all the time. And children in schools are meant to be taught British values. And there's something really, in my mind, pitiful about this, because even as I was growing up, I'm only in my late 30s, I knew what British values were. I still do, I think. I certainly got a sense of what being British is, and an immovable sense of that. But we've had to change that, because if you invite in the world, you've basically got to change your self-definition. And so we have this thing now where instead of it being an identifiable thing you can touch, you can feel, being British is a sort of set of rather pat things about, being British is about being inclusive. It's never about anything that could keep anyone out. It's only about things that could keep the widest possible range of people in. And, this is what we're reduced to, because we're trying to include the world.
The whole point of a definition is that it excludes other things. I mean, that is almost the definition of a definition. You talk about, you talk about in the novel Submission, there is the scene where the protagonist tries to go back and recapture some of the feeling of Christianity. You write in The Strange Death of Europe of how the decay of Christianity, living in a post-Christian world, has basically pulled out the bottom block of the tower, so that you have nothing to base your identity on.
Yes, this is a very painful bit in the book for me to write, and for a lot of readers. I'm just trying to say where I think we are. A lot of people aren't willing to do that. I'm not a believer myself, so I say this not from a point to try to prove my own rightness, but just to diagnose, to define. And my own view is that, yes, we are in this extraordinary void at the moment because we no longer want to sustain the things that got us here. And indeed, we're doing something which I think is very common across the West, and I think in America in particular at the moment, which is to sort of assume that where you and I are at the moment is the natural default position of mankind. That basically, if you went through any period in history, we could be in the 5,000 years ago, we could be 400 years ago, we could be 70 years ago, and basically it would all sort of default to where we are now. We'd be having a conversation on Skype about the same ideas. None of this takes into account the far more obvious thing is that what you and I enjoy, what the people we know enjoy, is unbelievable blip at the end point of a process, none of which was inevitable, none of which was always going to get us here. And so the ideas matter. That's why, by the way, sorry, just quickly to go back to the Islam thing, that's why nobody wants to talk about what Islam's ideas and values are, because we just kind of hope that it doesn't matter and that ideas don't matter and that we'd have always got here, and the same thing with this desire to sort of basically rewrite our past. We're always going to be here. We're always going to enjoy these human rights. And now all we've got to do is nix a little bit of the transgender bit still, fix a little bit of other bits of rights, make women and men exactly the same, and a couple of other really simple processes, and then we're sort of in nirvana. And I think this is all predicated on lies. It's all lies, terrible, terrible misreadings, ignorance, lies. But at least let's be honest, whatever we think, at least let's diagnose where we are honestly. And as I say, I find very few, ones of people willing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am a Jew who became a Christian at the age of 50. And I keep reading. Yours is maybe the fifth or sixth book, including Submission, actually, that puts forward the idea that only with Christianity can our civilization stand, but I cannot believe, as an intellectual man of the moment, right. I simply cannot believe. And I think that is where the crisis lies. I really do think we need a new Oxford movement that brings intellectual weight to the
that's
faith.
Possible. I mean, it's one of the directions it could go in. And there's a number of directions, I think. One of them is that thing of, yes, returning to a source. Now, some people, by the way, returning to the source and see it as the Enlightenment. I'm not entirely opposed to that by any means. Mm-hmm. I think that it has its own sort of creation myth and so on.
Yes.
But there are various ways you can go back to this. What I just urge people to do in this book is to return seriously to this debate, to recognize the reality of where we are, to recognize the truth of how we got here, and to at least involve themselves in that serious and profound discussion, whether they're believers or non-believers. I do say at one point in the book that if we could mend what has been the believer versus non-believer rift of recent years and recognize that, I quote a former Bishop of Edinburgh, we're basically Christians, whether we like it or
right,
not.
Of course, yeah.
If we sort of recognize some of that, you can get towards healing this rift. What I do know, though, is that with all of the challenges we now face in our societies, I just cannot see any way round or through them that doesn't involve an addressing of this fundamental schism.
Yes. Now, you mentioned the Marcelo Pero book, which was one of the books I read, and I think you're absolutely right. Mm. I wish I could talk to you. I would talk to you for another hour. I really could, but I'm out of time.
We'll do that one day.
Yes, but please, if you're in L.A., please do look me up. And I just think it's a terrific book, The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam, by Douglas Murray. Douglas, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure.
All right.
Good morning. Good to see you. I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. Today we're live from Wychwood School in Oxford. Welcome everybody to The Big Questions. Well, in Wednesday's Queen's speech, the government promised another raft of legislation to prevent radicalisation, tackle extremism in all its forms and promote community integration. Well, so far, the government's prevent strategy has most often been accused of targeting Muslims and effectively discriminating against their religious beliefs. Well, now they're planning to intervene when local councils aren't doing enough to counter extremism, to close unregulated madrasa and religious schools, and bring in ASBO-style banning orders for those described as key extremist influencers. So the list of those who can now be targeted may lengthen from people who actually do bad things to people who merely think bad things. And the government's definition of peddling hatred could be someone else's deeply held religious belief. Is countering extremism compatible with freedom of religion? Douglas Murray, Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Aren't you a key extremist influencer? And be so critical of Islam. I mean, you're a neocon hate preacher, aren't you? Some of the things you've said.
Well, I suppose that some very extreme people might claim that. I'd be surprised if you could hold it up. If I can answer the question that we started with.
Well, you've said some things in the past. Conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board. All immigration into Europe from Muslim countries must stop.
I've always been of the view that it's unwise to have immigration at the rate it's happened in recent years. And I think it's a very unwise thing to do what Chancellor Merkel has done the last year, to have immigration effectively at such a speed that you can't have an integrated society. That's what we're seeing, I would argue.
But if you said the same thing of Jews...
If I just finish the point. This is what we're seeing the impact of across Europe at the moment. It's a very great concern. You see, a lot of what government in this country and elsewhere is trying to do at the moment is to make up, to catch up with the effects of its immigration policies. Because if you have, as Germany has now, an extra 2% of your population coming into the country every year, I would argue you don't have a hope of having an integrated society. You don't have a hope of having a cohesive society. And as for the argument that, as it were, this is something you wouldn't say about any other group and so on, I can assure you that if any other minority group within a society had a constant record of producing a minority within it, but a minority that is significant, of people who, for instance, blow up tubes, or buses, or fly planes into the Twin Towers, or, as happened 3 years ago today, murder a soldier on the streets of London, decapitate him in broad daylight for being a member of the British Army, I would say you would say that about any other group. I think you would be deeply concerned about any group in society that had that, even as I say, as it is, a very distinct minority. Let me just remind you of one other fact, if I may, whilst you've got me onto it. Which is that a lot of other minorities, I think rightly, are concerned about this. As a gay man, it doesn't enormously please me that, as a poll fronted by Trevor Phillips the other week showed, the majority of Muslims in the UK want homosexuality to be made illegal. Not on board with gay marriage, not entirely hot with civil partnerships, but want homosexuality to be made illegal. So I think this raises all sorts of questions, and I think they're very legitimate questions to be raised, and in my view, they're not raised often enough.
Give me one case, even in Muslim countries, where they practice Sharia law, where they go as a routine, hold on, in routine. Most Muslim countries do not do the death penalty, they do not do the stoning, they do not do all these things. This is most Muslim countries that are supposed to run under Sharia law.
Let me...
Some do, but they are...
It shouldn't be necessary to have to shoot this down, but let me do it. Sunni, Shia, two most important distinctions within Islam. The most important Sunni state in the world, Saudi Arabia, executes people for being gay.
The greatest friend of the UK.
He crucifies people, beheads people and crucifies. Recently sentenced to beheading and then crucifixion an underage young Shia man because of his familial connections with the Shia family that the Sunni house of Saudi Arabia didn't want to live. Then let's go to the other side then, to the Shia powers. The most important Shia country in the world is Iran. In Iran, you get killed for being gay, you'll be stoned to death as a woman if you're an adulterer, or hanged from a crane if you're lucky. So please let's not have this stupid cover, because we are cleverer than you think we are. Anyone in this country can look at the internet, they can read articles. You cannot cover that over. It's fact. It's what's going on. It's what ISIS is currently trying to do in the territories that it controls. It doesn't come from nowhere. And if we're going to talk about extremism, a great deal... Let me finish this point. A great deal would be improved in this country if people like you came into studios like this and admitted that there is a problem, and admitted that you wanted to join in finding a solution to that problem, instead of trying to pretend that the problem doesn't exist.
Rizwan, are those views a very conservative, orthodox...
But let me just pick up on a very important point that this raises. You see, if an Anglican or somebody saying they were speaking in the name of Anglican Christianity, today, in the street, beheaded somebody in the name of the Christian God, and we came on this programme a week from now, do you think that there would be a single Anglican Christian in the country who would not say, it's disgusting, it's appalling, we abhor this? Do you think there would be anybody, like the lineup we have here, of people providing excuses or saying, how dare you talk about our religion? How dare you talk about Anglicanism? This is the problem. These two gentlemen here epitomise the problem.
Linda can respond. Linda respond. Don't worry. We've got time. What was it? You said it's racism, is it? Yeah, okay. Let's address that in just a second. Douglas Murray, do you want to come back in here?
Well, just quickly, because you mentioned the thing of British values. What a lot of this is I'm not the world's greatest fan of the prevent strategy. I think it's an attempt by government to deal with a pretty insoluble problem, actually, as I said at the outset.
Insoluble?
A fairly insoluble problem.
That's pretty pessimistic.
Well, look, I mean, if you've got a choice between whether or not you believe you should follow David Cameron or Allah, a lot of Muslims will follow Allah, amazingly enough. It's
because the world is split into good and bad, isn't it?
The thing that's worth...
I think even Peter would take the latter, given that choice.
So let me just get back. So what we...
You'd follow David Cameron.
If you would just allow me to finish one sentence, you might learn something.
I don't patronise
the really interesting thing is, Nicky, is that what our government in Britain is trying to do, as a result, as I said at the beginning, of the mass immigration they've had in recent decades, is to try to build a cohesive society and to cohere society. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this government, as with the previous government, doesn't particularly have the confidence to say Britain and British values, British institutions and so on. So what are we doing? We're basically trying to make it liberal values, that Britain will be about liberal values, about gay marriage, about all sorts of other things. They've pinned this on. I, by the way, think this is a big mistake, because it's all very well saying we will make people liberals, but that doesn't mean, among other things, you make them, as it were, British or with any other sense of identity. So the interesting thing is, though, that because the British government has decided effectively the best we can do is to make people vaguely liberal, then it means that the qualifications for extremism, as it were, are exactly, effectively conservative ideas. And that is why the Islam thing keeps on posing such an issue. Because, you see, in terms of social liberalism, Islam is the slowest kid in the class. And we are all speaking at the level of the slowest kid in the class. And that is a problem that we're not going to get over for a long time to come.
Right-wingers claim it is. Why is Islam...
Right-winger.
Not you. Why is Islam... Why is Islam the fastest growing religion in the Western world? That says it all. It is.
That's the end of it. That's the end of it. That's the end of it.
So, listen, I'm going to talk about two works. One is Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, and the other is Terminator. They're going to be spoilers. So if you think you're going to read these books, you know, I'm giving stuff away. There's just no way to talk about them without going through the whole thing. But I'll give you a moment. Turn down your dial so you don't have to listen. You know, we're talking about the individual and what it means to believe in the sacredness of the individual experience and what it means not to believe in it. And some of this is becoming more and more complicated as technology goes forward. You know, I've had to wrestle with a lot of questions recently in my life. Mostly what I do is write. That is the purpose of my life. The purpose of my life is to write things down, to make beautiful things. And I write fiction and I write nonfiction, and I try to write things that will matter to people, obviously. But recently, I've noticed that because as my worldview has changed and developed, I was always a hard-boiled, down-to-earth, realistic detective detective story writer. I would write crime fiction. And recently, it's become very hard for me to write realistically and express what I want to express. And that's where you got something like Another Kingdom, which is a sort of hard-boiled story that then goes into this fantasy world. And now, I'm wrestling with how to do this. And one of the things that makes fiction so difficult right now is how fast technology is developing. So if you think about the fact that the internet has been around for like 25 years and has changed everything. It's changed everything. So you write a story before the internet and it's virtually out of place. I mean, it's almost like reading an historical novel. And so it's very hard to keep up. And I started to look at science fiction. And science fiction has never been my favorite kind of fiction because it deals with ideas too often and doesn't deal with character. And character is what I think is essential to fiction. But I was thinking about these two questions of this question of where we're going with technology. And these two works, Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End and the Terminator film, the first Terminator film. I never care about any sequel. People always tell me Terminator 2 is a great sequel. It is a good sequel, but only the original idea has the core, the kernel of the thought in it that makes it really come to life for me. Now, recently, I was reading this book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I mentioned him earlier. He's an Israeli professor, materialist, doesn't believe in free will. And he talks at the end of this book, and he has a new book which is about this, which I haven't read, about what is going to happen with technology. And he talks about how we are going to evolve out of ourselves. And there's no stopping this. So for instance, we're going to enhance our memory. So our memory, we might be able to remember everything. We're going to be able to blend our minds. So I might be able to remember your memories. We're going to be able to replace our parts with cyborg parts. We might even be able to live forever, not just immortal, which means you live until a car runs you over, but immortal, which means you live forever. All these things, he says, we're going to be transformed into gods. And I thought about that, the idea that we would be transformed into gods, but not human. None of the things that we think about now, care about now, love now, that matter to us now are going to matter to creatures who do not have the bodies that we have. Death itself has contributed so much to the meaning of our life and to our speculation of what comes after death that it would just be, these people would be unrecognizable as human beings. They would be a new thing. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke is probably his best book. He's the guy who wrote the script of 2001, A Space Odyssey. It is about these aliens who come down to Earth. They're called the overlords. And they simply give the people of Earth the technology they need to have peace, to develop all kinds of medicines. They basically create paradise on Earth. But what they strip human beings of is their creativity, because once you have an overlord, you don't need to create things yourself. Everything is fine. Everything goes perfectly. Life, and people buy into this. Most of the people buy into this. But the one thing the overlords never do is they never show you themselves. They won't let the people see them until paradise has really locked in. Now you're living in paradise. And now, like 50 years after they come down, they finally come out and show themselves. Here's from the TV show, the sci-fi TV show, the scene where the overlords finally come out and show people what they look like. And if you couldn't see it, if you're just listening, they look like Satan, basically. They look like the devil. And the idea here is that people had the knowledge that they would show up, and they turned them into evil people. They're not evil. They're just the next phase. And what finally happens is a new generation of children are born under this regime that have special powers and can link to each other's minds, and they are the next version of humankind. They're one mind, and the old version of humankind becomes sterile, ceases to have children, and life loses its meaning, and they die out. And that's why the overlords are here. They're there to transition us into this new world where we're no longer human beings. We're just a single mind in touch with the universe. Usually, when you think about Terminator, you think about the killer drones. You think about this idea that machines started building themselves. They started building killer drones. Glenn Reynolds of Instapundit has a piece about this in USA Today. I think Fred Saberhagen wrote the novels that kind of inspired this vision of Skynet. But if you think about it, what Terminator is also about is defending the human. And we might have to defend the human from something more advanced than the human. We might have to defend the human from something that seems to us godlike, but eliminates who, in fact, we are. And, of course, the classic moment, you remember Terminator. Terminator is about a robot, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is a cyborg, who is sent back to kill an ordinary woman. And one of the things I love about this movie that the sequels all ruin is she's just a schmo. She's just an ordinary woman worried about her hairdo, worried about the latest rock songs, worried about her dates and all this. And she just couldn't be more ordinary. But she is going to give birth to the hero who is going to fight back against Skynet and the machines. And the wonderful line at the end, the wonderful line that became kind of iconic, there's so many quotable lines in the movie, almost every line is quotable, I'll be back and all that stuff. But this is the wonderful line that I always love, where the hero finally comes out of nowhere, after the cyborg comes out of nowhere and starts to kill her, she doesn't know what's going on, and then the hero comes out of nowhere and he has this famous line.
Come with me if you want to live.
I just love that scene. Is come with me if you want to live. And the emphasis is on live. If you want humanity to live, what happens in the Terminator movie, as I'm sure almost everybody knows, is basically the hero from the future sleeps with this ordinary girl from the present, and they conceive together the hero. And the salvific act in this moment is the act of sex, the act of a man and a woman coming together to create another person. And of course, that is the thing that is so under threat. All these feminists, I'm always yelling about the feminists, the left attacking men and women. They attack the fact of men and women, the differences between men and women, the complementarity between men and women, the sacredness of sex and childbirth, why we protect it with so many rituals and with marriage, and why we fight against abortion, the very fact of childbirth. We are defending the human race, even if it turns out the progressives are right, and to me, the progressives always seem like savages. They always seem like they're regressing into the world of savagery. But in fact, maybe they are anticipating this world that goes beyond humanity. And what we are saying is, no, if you save the world, if you make the world a perfect place, but you don't make it a perfect place for humans, what have you done? What have you done? If you advance beyond your humanity, have you actually advanced at all, or have you simply disappeared? Have you simply ended the human race? All of these guys, Harari, the guy who wrote this book I'm talking about, Sam Harris, they all become snakebit by Buddhism. They all love Buddhism. And Buddhism is essentially a suprahuman philosophy, because what Buddhism really says is you don't have to suffer. You don't have to suffer. You can rise above your suffering if you simply rise above your desires. If you simply stop being a natural human and rise above that state, you can become something that doesn't suffer. Jesus says something entirely different. He says, take up your cross and follow me. Suffer and live. Come with me if you want to live. We're really in a conversation about the future, because some of these things you're not going to be able to stop them. When they enhance people's memory, it's going to be to solve Alzheimer's. So who's going to stop them from making that? But if I take it and don't have Alzheimer's, then I'll have a super memory. So that, these things are going to come in a way that can't be stopped. But we can lay the blueprint of where we go. We don't have to go where science can go. We can go where we want to go. And I think that defending humanity is a worthwhile thing. And I really do think that's the conversation. The conversation we're having is not about how to prevent gunshots. It's not how to prevent evil. You'll never prevent evil. That's the whole point. The conversation that we're having is whether or not the individual human experience is worth preserving now and into the future. The Klavanless Weekend is upon us. Go listen to Another Kingdom. I'm still pitching this thing. I got 2 more pitches tomorrow for the movie, the TV version or a movie version. And we really need you to be there as an audience and to leave the ratings. Got over 2,000 5-star ratings. It is a really, really entertaining story voiced by some guy named Michael Knowles, who did a great job. We went long today, so you can treasure this, but the Klavanless Weekend is unavoidable. It will come. Survivors gather here on Monday. I'm Andrew Klavan. This is The Andrew Klavan Show.